My mother was at work and my father had just gotten home from shopping. My father hadn't gotten the job for the airport. Before my father came home, my bigger sister was watching over me, and once my father got home, my bigger sister had to get ready for work. My father entered the house asking us, "Hey, have you seen the new neighbor? I didn't even know that old neighbor moved out." My big sister, "Yeah, I had no idea either. There's a couple of trucks out by their house." Of course, me eavesdropping on the conversation, I go look out of the window to check if I could see who this neighbor was. There was an old lady dressed in a white gown. She was setting up her plants in front of her house and watering them. Nothing too out of the extraordinary. I go back and sit down, play with my N64. My father, gathering up a few flowers, had the idea to go greet the new neighbor and give her some totally real and not fake flowers. But overall, it was nice. My father left the house. I jumped up and watched the window. My father had given the old lady a hug and some flowers he had gathered up. She was also smiling. Nothing too out of the extraordinary. The next day goes by. It being either Thursday or Friday, my big sister asked me if I wanted to go play outside. I say yes. I had a bike that I got for my birthday that I rarely used, because my mother barely let me play outside, perhaps for my safety. My big sister didn't go outside of the house, and instead she stayed inside and would check on me from the window every 5 minutes or so. I exited through the front door, walking with my bike down the driveway. I see a rose in front of our driveway on the road. I picked up the rose and went to the neighbor's house. I knocked on her door. No response. Waited for about 3 minutes, but it felt longer. I knocked again. No response. I left the rose by her door and went back to playing around on my bike for a few. Nothing else happened later that day. A day later, it's Friday. My big sister comes home. She had told my dad that he supposedly dropped flower sepal all over their front door. She had already cleaned it all up. My father had denied it and said that he checked to see if there was any mess before re-entering the house, and that maybe he made an error while checking, but he vividly remembers nothing being there. I found it weird, but I didn't mind any of it because I was a child. I didn't know anything. Someone comes knocking at our door. My father opens it, and it was the new neighbor. She had flowers in her hand and wanted to give back a gift as how she received. My father told her that the flowers smelled really nice, but there was a weird look I had seen many times from my father, and it's only when he feels weird or disgusted. The neighbor looks behind my father and sees me and smiles. The old woman gave my father a smile, and I run back to the window to check where the old lady was going. I was a nosy kid. The lady didn't go towards her house. She didn't appear in front of the window, which was weird. She goes directly in front of our house just to get to hers, but I didn't see her at all. Later that night, I was tired and decided to take a nap. The window in my room was closed and the blinds were shut. I was dozing off and could have sworn that every time I closed my eyes, the window would open, and as soon as I opened my eyes, it would close. It wasn't until I ran out into the living room, which was terribly dark. The only source of light was from the front of the living room, where there was a window. The lighting being a dark blue color, which made it even scarier. No one else was awake, besides me. While I was in the living room, I heard the window in my room open, and a breeze came through. The sound of wind made it even scarier. I didn't go check in my room, but I knew the window was open because of a loud click, shutter sounds, also the sound of wind coming through. Some rose pellets flew in, and I grew so scared that I ran down the hallway where my parents' room was and sat by their door. In the living room, there was a shadow that looked as if it was standing, but I remembered that there was a coat rack in the living room, so I figured it was just that. But when I saw it move, I started crying and crying until my dad opened his door, kneeling down, asking me what's wrong and if I'm okay. There was a loud slam sound coming from my room. The window just shut. My dad went to check what it is, but before he even entered my room, he saw the rose pellets all over the ground and came back and asked, "What the fuck happened?" I couldn't make out words. I was stuttering terribly and was crying on top of that. A few hours later, I was watching some TV. Anyone remember the Pink Panther? There were flashing lights outside. An ambulance was at the neighbor's house, the neighbor being carried on a stretcher. Turns out the neighbor passed away after moving in. My neighbor Andy suspected that he was being followed. Every day when I would see him leave his apartment or get out of his car, his eyes were always searching around, trying to find whoever was watching him. Except for me. He knew I watched him. Sorry, I get that sounds weird. Let me explain. A few years ago, I was your everyday normal chick getting ready to take on the world then. Bam. Car accident comes out of nowhere and completely throws me for a loop. It took me a while to recover, and with the help of a wheelchair, I can mostly do everything that used to make me feel good. Thanks to the large settlement and my schooling, I was able to set myself up with a nice little home business so I didn't have to go out much. It's nice not having to deal with people side-eyeing me as I roll through the hall. It's obvious, so stop doing it. It's also nice because I can people watch through my living room window. Not too long after he moved in, Andy caught me looking at him through my window and seemed off-put. But he must not have known that I'm in a wheelchair, because when he came to confront me, he looked super embarrassed when I opened my door. I'm sure he was expecting some old nosy neighbor and not a young woman in a wheelchair. We apologized to each other for the misunderstanding and became neighbor friends, and were on track to becoming friends. One day I saw that he was extremely nervous and anxious looking. I asked what was wrong, and he told me about his stalker. It had started when he was shopping one day and noticed someone constantly ducking behind things when he looked over his shoulder or scanned the crowd. He didn't think much of it at the time, but in the weeks that followed, things seemed to escalate. He told me that he began to notice things like finger marks on his car, like someone had tried to break in. He was also beginning to get calls at work from someone who would just breathe into the phone and then hang up before saying anything. Finally, he knew something was weird when he was coming out of the gym, and the attendant asked him where his friend was. Confused, Andy asked, "What do you mean?" "The person that's always coming in and out like 2 minutes after you," said Gym Guy. "I didn't see them today." Andy texted me from his car right after this happened. He said that he had never been more terrified in his life, and he didn't know what to do. I asked if he went to the cops, and he told me they couldn't do anything because he didn't have any actual evidence. He was thinking of going to buy a gun the next day to protect himself. I told him I understood and I would comfort him when he got home. That night when Andy came home, he slammed and locked his door as soon as he got in. He checked his peephole to see if anyone came up the stairs behind him. Once he was satisfied that he wasn't followed up the stairs, he walked past his blacked-out living room window to his bedroom and got cleaned up. From the way he kept looking around him, it was pretty clear that he still felt like he was being watched. His eyes darted around the apartment. It was a small space, but it had plenty of places to hide. It looked like he wanted to search the place, but didn't know where to start. That's when I made my move. Slowly, I pushed open the cabinet door and crept silently into the kitchen. My vantage point had been low, but luckily the apartment was pretty open, so I always had a great view. He didn't hear or suspect anything until I had already gotten the wire around his neck. He was taller and much heavier than I was, but it didn't matter since I had surprise and leverage. I wrapped myself around the back of his torso and we fell backwards onto the floor with a loud thud. I felt his body struggle under my legs. My heart pounded with ecstasy as the last of his life escaped him. Once I was sure he was dead, I rolled him off me and made my way through the hidden doorway back to my apartment. After the accident, I thought I might never kill again due to it losing the intense pleasure it once brought me. I had even begun to fear that I had lost my sociopathy and was actually going to develop emotions. Gag. Then I figured out that the accident didn't take away my abilities, it merely refined them. No longer could I merely kill someone. I now had to work much harder to grow the fear in my victims to improve my pleasure. Once I figured out that the wheelchair gave me an unbelievable cover, all I had to do was adjust my technique. Back in my apartment, I cleaned myself up and sat back down in my chair. To watch more neighbors, make more friends, find more pleasure. It was a bright Saturday morning when Lisa and her husband Mark moved into their new home on Elm Street. The quaint suburban neighborhood seemed perfect for starting their new life together. The house itself was everything they had dreamed of, complete with a white picket fence and a spacious backyard. The only thing missing was getting to know the neighbors. As they unloaded the moving truck, a tall man in his late 50s wearing a faded baseball cap approached them. He introduced himself as Mr. Thompson, their next-door neighbor. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Mr. Thompson said with a warm smile. "If you need any help, don't hesitate to ask." Lisa and Mark thanked him and continued with their unpacking. Despite his friendly demeanor, Lisa couldn't shake off an uneasy feeling about Mr. Thompson. There was something about his piercing blue eyes that sent shivers down her spine. Over the next few weeks, Lisa noticed that Mr. Thompson was always around. He seemed to appear out of nowhere, whether she was gardening in the front yard or taking out the trash. His constant presence began to feel invasive. One evening, as Lisa was preparing dinner, she looked out the kitchen window and saw Mr. Thompson standing in his backyard staring directly into their house. She quickly closed the blinds and tried to dismiss it as her imagination running wild. Mark, on the other hand, didn't share her concerns. "He's just a friendly old man, Lisa. You're overthinking it," he said, trying to reassure her. But Lisa's unease grew with each passing day. She started noticing other odd things: strange noises at night, items in their yard moved or missing, and the feeling of being watched whenever she stepped outside. One night, unable to sleep, Lisa decided to take a walk around the house to clear her mind. As she walked past the living room window, she saw a faint light coming from Mr. Thompson's house. Curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to take a closer look. She quietly slipped out the front door and walked towards Mr. Thompson's house. As she approached, she noticed that the light was coming from the basement. Peering through the small basement window, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The basement walls were covered with photographs of her and Mark. There were pictures of them in the yard, inside their house, and even in their bedroom. In the center of the room was a table with various personal items that had gone missing from their home. Lisa stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran back to her house and locked all the doors and windows. She woke Mark and told him what she had seen. Mark, seeing the genuine fear in her eyes, agreed that they needed to take action. The next morning, they decided to confront Mr. Thompson. They knocked on his door, and after a few moments, he answered, looking surprised to see them. "Is everything all right?" he asked, feigning innocence. "We need to talk," Mark said sternly. "We know you've been spying on us." Mr. Thompson's expression changed from surprise to anger. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, his voice cold. "Lisa saw the pictures in your basement," Mark said. "We know what you've been doing." For a moment, there was silence. Then, without warning, Mr. Thompson lunged at Mark, trying to push him off the porch. A struggle ensued, and Lisa quickly called the police. When the police arrived, they arrested Mr. Thompson and searched his house. They found the basement exactly as Lisa had described, along with more disturbing evidence, detailed plans of their daily routines, personal information about them, and even a hidden camera feed from inside their house. With Mr. Thompson in custody, Lisa and Mark hoped that their nightmare was over. But the psychological scars remained. They installed a security system and took extra precautions, but the feeling of being watched lingered. A few months later, they received a visit from Detective Harris, the lead investigator on their case. He had some unsettling news. "We've been looking into Mr. Thompson's past," Detective Harris said. "It appears he's been doing this for years. He moves into neighborhoods, befriends his neighbors, and then starts stalking them. In most cases, the victims never even realized they were being watched." Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. "What happens to him now?" she asked. "He's facing multiple charges, and given the evidence, he'll likely be put away for a long time," the detective assured her. "But I'd still advise you to stay vigilant." As the weeks turned into months, Lisa and Mark tried to move on with their lives. They made new friends in the neighborhood, started a garden, and even adopted a dog for extra security. But the memory of Mr. Thompson's cold blue eyes and the pictures in his basement never truly faded. A year later, the house next door was sold. The new neighbors, a young couple named Sarah and David, seemed friendly enough. Lisa and Mark welcomed them warmly, hoping to create a fresh start. One evening, Sarah came over for coffee. As they chatted, she mentioned something that made Lisa's heart skip a beat. "You know, the previous owner left some strange things behind," Sarah said. "We found a hidden compartment in the basement filled with old photos and personal items. It was really creepy." Lisa's face turned pale. "What kind of photos?" she asked, dreading the answer. "Just random pictures of people. Some of them seemed really old." "We turned everything over to the police," Sarah replied nonchalantly. Lisa forced a smile. but inside she felt the old fear creeping back. Could there be more to Mr. Thompson's story than they had uncovered? Were there other victims, other neighborhoods where he had left his mark? Later that night, Lisa couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the hidden compartment and the old photos. She decided to do some research on Mr. Thompson's past, something she had avoided until now. She discovered that Mr. Thompson had lived in several states over the past few decades, always moving every few years. There were news reports of similar cases in each location, neighbors who felt they were being watched, personal items going missing, and in some cases, more sinister outcomes. Lisa contacted Detective Harris and shared her findings. He agreed that it was worth looking into and promised to reopen the investigation. A few weeks later, Detective Harris called with an update. "We've found more evidence linking Mr. Thompson to similar cases across the country," he said. "It appears he's been doing this for over 20 years. He's a master manipulator, always staying one step ahead." The realization that they had narrowly escaped a potentially deadly situation was overwhelming, but Lisa also felt a sense of relief knowing that they had played a part in stopping Mr. Thompson's reign of terror. As time passed, Lisa and Mark continued to rebuild their lives, finding strength in each other and their newfound sense of community. They remained vigilant, but they no longer lived in fear. The experience had changed them forever, but it also brought them closer together. They learned to trust their instincts and to always be aware of their surroundings. And as they looked out over their peaceful neighborhood, they knew that they had faced their darkest fears and come out stronger on the other side.